Well, thank you very much. It's interesting to be in a place where this is actually seen as cold weather. And I was complaining to one of my friends in Minneapolis that it was, got down to 48 last night, which of course is much higher than the high that I left. I was flying out of Minneapolis and expecting 6 inches of snow to land in my house when I left. So I don't know what happened, but it's really great to be here for lots of reasons, one of which is sunshine, but also to seeing all of you people in one room is quite amazing. As Sina mentioned, I had 3 days to dash to a few of your farms. I didn't see all of you, but I saw several of you, and it was a very brief visit, way too quick, but I think folks gave me a pretty good grounding on what's going on and what some of the potentials are here. And what I'd like to do today is to really kind of give you a report about what I found when I was in the state. Both the interviews I did, but also the data I collected about the food economy of southern Arizona. And we have 2 reports, one of which is the economic numbers, and the second one is kind of more of the interviews that I had with some of you to talk more in a more nuanced way about the food system. I'm going to focus on the numbers today, but I would encourage us to think about using these to really take some steps forward. I'll be here all day and really eager to talk with you about what this data means to you. If you have any questions, we can have some of that this morning to really answer them right here, but also later on, I'm happy to talk more about the data or where we go with this. So that's what I want to do. If I put it there, can you hear me okay in the back still? Okay. I'm going to do 3 things today, basically. The first thing is to really kind of outline how I think about food, because I feel like it's important for me as a speaker to tell you my biases and my worldview, so you have a chance of comparing mine with yours. And I'm not expecting you to agree with everything I say, but this is my best guess about how we frame this so that it really has some lasting power for all of us. I see a lot of false framing out there, and I like to kind of give the framing that I think will give us the most power to have farmers be powerful, to have local circles be powerful. Hopefully that'll be helpful for you in thinking about your own way of doing the work you do. Secondly, I will show you the results of the data set that I've compiled for the food bank, and that has some very rich findings, some of which are discouraging. And the reason I give you discouraging numbers on a bright sunny morning like this is that I think if we don't look very honestly at what's going on, it's very hard to make things better. I see a lot of groups that really run down the road saying they're going to change the food system, and they replicate the very issues they're trying to solve by attaching to the wrong systems. And I think if we don't understand the system and how it works and how it works against us, it's very hard to make progress. So that's the spirit in which I do that. Some of the numbers are discouraging, but they also represent phenomenal opportunity for those of you who are growing here. And hopefully we'll be able to see both sides of that. Finally, I will finish with some stories about cool projects around the country that I've had a chance to interact with that I hope will give you some sense of new possibilities and also just sort of an encouragement from what's going on around the U.S. So hopefully that'll all happen today. As Sina mentioned, I worked a lot, as you saw the map briefly before, this is the map showing all the regions in the United States. I've done an assessment like the one I'm about to show you today. One funder paid for 4 of these. The Leopold Center at Iowa State also managed to kind of come up with funds for about 6 in Iowa. Other than that, this is spread by word of mouth. And that's what I'm most proud of. People have heard this work, they've liked it, they've told their friends in another state, and that other state has contacted me and said, let's do this here. It's really remarkable to be having a chance to visit most of these places, to be with people, to see the energy in this incredibly vibrant food movement we have nationally. It's also a phenomenal education for me to see all these places and see how the issues play out in different cropping regimes and climates and cultures. I like to start by pondering about what is it a food system is supposed to accomplish? I think that's something we often don't step back and look at. What really should we be getting done at the end of the day? My proposal is we have to think about a fairly complex definition. I know some farmers who would say, if I had a good year last year, the food system's working fine. And I don't think is a very satisfying explanation of what progress really looks like. In my view, a food system should build in our communities health, wealth, connection, and capacity. I don't think it's any surprise to any people in this room that food is a very important part of health. Obviously, what we eat and how we eat it, and exercise is also important, really is the most important steps we can take to be healthy people. We also know, especially, again, farmers know, that if the food system's not building wealth for primary producers like farmers, it's not succeeding, and it hasn't done very well with that for a number of years. So we know that's also important. We often tend to forget the fact that food system is also about connection as well. When I was at many of your farms, you fed me because that was part of your way of being hospitable, saying this is who we are, this is kind of how we are hospitable. When I have my family over for a holiday, what I will do is I will serve foods that come out of my ethnic heritage. I will serve foods my great-grandmother would have served on a wood stove. And this is part of my way of saying, this is my people, this is my culture, this is my place on the earth. Food is it's central to how we connect as people, yet a lot of our food planning ignores that fact totally. I think it's important to bring that into our discussion. Finally, we need to have the capacity to handle food safely. If we'd had a meeting like this in this ranch 100 years ago, almost everyone in the room would have had really good experience cooking food and preparing food, and that's actually true today because most of you are farmers, but in a lot of meetings I go to, people really aren't cooking. Most critically, a lot of inner city people have not bought pots or pans because they don't think that's anything has to do with eating. They basically microwave or go to fast food or eat out. And I think it's a real comment in American society that for all the bells and whistles our food has, and all the packaging and all the pretty stuff that's out there, we're actually dumber as a society now about food than we were 100 years ago. 100 years ago, almost everybody knew that you had to keep meat and vegetables separate while you were cooking to keep from contamination. Now, people, actually I had a woman a couple weeks ago who ran out of my speech and called her mother and said, "Mom, I gotta learn how to cook." She's a 45-year-old senior executive. She's never felt the need. And I think that's the most amazing thing about this is, again, bringing that capacity back personally. So my sense is that our food system that we have is failing on all four of these counts. It's actually building very bad health outcomes for the mainstream American at considerable public expense. I'll show you a little bit about that later. We're building wealth for some at the expense of others, which is one part of why we're not connecting around food. We're actually getting the producer much more separate from the consumer than we've ever been before. And you folks, of course, are very central to reweaving those connections. And finally, we're dumber as a society about food than we were. So if we believe these are the goals the food system should accomplish, we have to do some serious thinking, don't we? We have to really not just kind of do good work in local food. We have to really reconfigure an entire food system in the United States. And that's not trivial work. And you folks know that better than I do. The key economic insight I would leave you with today, if you remember nothing else from what I said, is that the food system is extremely efficient at taking wealth out of our communities, especially rural communities, and giving that to someone else. This is the uncomfortable truth a lot of people don't want to talk about. Those are the people who run us into the same problems later because they're not willing to kind of look at the honest economics of the situation. If you understand this, you know that if you attach to a system that's taking wealth out of your back pocket, you have to do that very carefully, otherwise it's going to take more wealth out of your back pocket. How do we make those connections in ways that really build the change we need over the long haul? Really tough questions. I'm sure a lot of you folks have good experience in handling those questions. That's part of what we have to bring into the planning mentality as public officials and food bank officials start wrestling with this issue for the future. I've also been arguing for several years that local foods is the best thing I can think of any one of us doing to promote economic recovery in the United States. And I'm not saying that simply because I'm in a room full of farmers. That's something I say to everybody. I cannot think of more important work to do than building local food systems. I've been saying that since before the crisis of 2008, when we lost a lot of our economic strength. The reason I say this is we spend about $1.2 trillion a year as a society buying food. That's more than the money we needed to bail out the banking system a few years back. Moreover, each of us, if we can, spends part of that money 3 times every day. There's nothing else in the economy that involves all of us so intimately, so frequently. We're always making decisions that shape the future of our grandchildren. Who do I buy food from? What kind of food do I buy? Through which channels do I buy that? Those decisions are made 3 times a day or more, end up having big impacts for generations to come. Nothing else involves all of us in the same way. If I came to you and said, February was a difficult month for me, I decided to opt out of the market for food this month. People would laugh a little bit. They'd say, Ken, watch out, because you might end up at the Tucson hospital at our expense. No one can opt out of the food market. Yet we have a system that basically excludes about 1/3 of our population and says, you're not going to eat well, you're not going to eat the proper foods. If we don't learn how to be inclusive in food, how do we learn how to do that when we're making automobiles, when we're building financial systems? How do we do that if we don't learn those skills in the food economy? We're forced to really be community-minded in ways that nothing else forces us to do. That's why I think the work you're doing is so essential, because if we can learn how to do business in a better way through food, we can extend that to economic recovery all over the country. I really do believe that. My final philosophical point would be to say, when I use the word local, for me it's a shorthand. I'm not one of those people who's going to argue to you that all the food you eat in 25 years should all come from Arizona. I don't think that'd be a bad thing, but it's not my argument. More than local food, I really believe in a kind of way of doing business, which a lot of you are doing already. I just think it's important to articulate that, which I call community-based food systems or community-based food businesses. These are businesses like yours that do business for more than the bottom line. They're people who do business to improve the environment and to improve social concerns as well as making a profit. A triple bottom line business, if you will, but they're also businesses that network together and to provide ways for money when it's earned in the Tucson area or southern Arizona to stay in that area, to be spent by people buying from each other, trading with each other. When a dollar comes in, how long does it take to leave? If we form business networks that allow those dollars to stay and keep working and keep getting reinvested, then we have a stronger economy for southern Arizona. If we do that in all regions of the country, we have a stronger national economy. When I use the word community-based food networks, a lot of people kind of shrivel up and say, what's that about? When I say local food, they seem to intuitively understand what I'm saying. But I want you to kind of know that when I use the term local food, I'm really thinking about it in this broader way. Well, I guess I should give you an example outside of food conspiracy of what I mean when I say that. My favorite story to tell right now is from Southeast Ohio. And I think this is also a reminder not only of some good work that's happened, but how long-term and slow this work can appear to be. In Athens, Ohio, a group of people back in the 1970s started asking some of the same questions you're raising today. Farmers who said, I'd like to not put my stuff on the truck, but I'd like to know the people who eat it. I'd like to actually have the chance to farm organically. I'd like to farm for local stores and local businesses. And also consumers who said, I want more choice over my food. I want to know where it came from. Those people started getting together, and as you see in this diagram, perhaps, there's a bakery and a Mexican restaurant that started in Southeast Ohio, both cooperatively run. Basically, early efforts to really connect a local food economy. They, of course, counted on local farms to supply them, and they found a lot of those farms through the Athens Farmers Market, which was the place that you went to learn who are the new growers who are coming to town, what are the new crops that are out there. And those relationships formed in the market were really central to building a local economy, not simply transferring produce. After a few years of doing this, though, some folks who were really pioneers in that effort kind of sat back and said, starting one business, well, they watched a food co-op start and fail. And they said, starting one business at a time in a hostile climate is not necessarily a winning strategy by itself. Can we step back and intervene in the system to make something more effective happen? So they formed a group called ACENET, Appalachian Community Enterprise Network, which focused in its early years on low-income communities in Southeast Ohio, focused on building community kitchens so that people who are low-income had an option of getting a certified kitchen and technical expertise to process, prepare, make a livelihood, maybe make a new commercial product that would actually possibly haul them out of poverty. And they decided that the community kitchen would be a very good vehicle for bringing a new discussion to low-income communities, especially in Southeast Ohio. Having done that for 15 or 20 years, they've helped spawn several food processing businesses to the point of where Kroger Athens, the Safeway of Southeast Ohio, if you will, has a 25-foot shelf featuring Ohio-raised products that are mostly coming from Southeast Ohio. That after 3 years of lobbying with that store, they said, yes, we'll feature the products from our local farms. You see some of the arrows in that diagram, some of the connections between local businesses that have formed over 40 years. This is not fast work, but it's been very deep-seated and very effective. Into that work came a dairy farm, the Diggs Hall farm, that was doing grass-fed, really high-quality milk in this region. And they were part of the mix. And at some point they said, we have really nice cows, we have really good milk, and we want someone to bottle us to make really fine milk for sale. And they called their friend Warren Taylor, who actually worked for Safeway globally, doing some of the biggest dairy plants in the world. Warren was a friend of theirs, and they called him and said, Warren, we'd like you to start a milk processing plant on our farm. We'll give you 2 acres of ground, you put up the factory. And Warren said, no, I'm retired. He said, no, you want to do this, Warren. And Warren thought about it a while and said, this is my opportunity. Although I meant to have a sort of relaxing retirement, this is something I cannot turn down. So he took out $1 million loan to put up a processing plant. He was lucky to have the power to do that. But he's also, having worked for Safeway and having done plants all over the world, he was trained by a guy who was a Navy guy, who told him, plan to be very efficient in a compact space. And so, this console that Warren developed, and he built himself, designed and built himself, allows him to control all the operations of the plant without moving more than 3 feet. He can flip switches and move it from the yogurt line to the skim milk line to the milk line, what have you. He's got a very high quality grass-fed milk. He does not homogenize it, he does pasteurize it. And he produces in cardboard cartons what's considered by Milkweed magazine, the kind of premier dairy journal, the number 1 or number 2 dairy product, or the number 2 milk in the country, along with Cedar Summit Farms, which I can buy from in Minnesota. Very high quality work. Warren designed this plant so that it uses 1/4 of the electricity of a normal plant this size. And he also recycles all the water he possibly can. So by his design of the system he created a competitive advantage for himself, being the low-cost producer of the highest quality milk in the country. It's a remarkable thing to be able to do in your first steps of a business. One thing that Warren has done is he realized that he generates a lot of skim milk because he'll take the cream and sell the cream, and he has the 2% milk, and he's skimming off a lot of cream. And some dairy farms take that skim milk and throw it away. Some dairy farms feed it to the pigs. Those are all good uses. Some dry it down to a dairy powder. Warren has realized he could take a nanofilter and filter that down to a very dense cream base that makes really good ice cream. So he's taking a product that some folks would say is a waste product, turning it into a high-value item, a base for ice cream. It's, I guess you'd call it condensed milk. And this is his business cluster. So you have, he buys some equipment suppliers, utilities, packaging materials suppliers. So he's buying a lot that's local, a lot that's national, and some is local. He's shipping food to 22 Whole Foods stores from Ohio to Washington, D.C., and that involves truckers as well. Kroger Athens has his milk featured on their shelf of local food. 13 independent stores in Ohio, when I talked to Warren, had bought his milk. And of course he buys milk from 2 local farms and local labor. But I'd like to focus on Jenny's Splendid Ice Creams because that's an especially good use. This is the company for which Warren makes his ice cream base. And when I met Warren, he was actually featuring his ice cream at a local festival. Pawpaws are a local product, and they were taking fresh pawpaws and making ice cream for sale, actually for giving away at this fest. Well, when I talked to Jenny Brittenbauer at Jenny's Ice Cream, she said, our growth is based on Snowville's growth. We're on the phone every week at least. Warren and I are always talking and saying, how is business going? How can we grow in a way that will help you out? How do we coordinate our efforts so that things are fine? When I want to think about opening a new store, say in Louisville, I will not take that step unless Warren is able to meet the production needs that I have, so I have the same high quality milk. Plus, when I want to make a new ice cream that has a different kind of flavor, he will adapt his mix so that it really matches perfectly the needs that I have. A very symbiotic relationship. To me, this is a prime indicator that you're succeeding. When local businesses start saying, let's collaborate so that we and the region get stronger. If you have that happening, you know that you're really getting where you want to go. Here's Jenny's cluster. She actually does low sugar, very beautiful, high quality ice creams, very rich, based on Ohio products. So she buys all these products from Ohio farmers, She even will buy all the strawberries in season, and she hires her staff for a couple weekends to put it all up, freeze it, so she has strawberries for year-round use for the ice cream plant. My favorite flavor of hers is a blueberry, sweet corn, and buttermilk ice cream, which is just to die for. Almost entirely made with Ohio products, except for the sweeteners. She uses electricity, fuel, and water. The more she can move that to green energy, the more the local multiplier increases. She hires local employees. The more they shop locally, the more the local multiplier increases. And she's really depending on this relationship with Snowville Creamery to make all this work. Those two businesses working together form a business cluster. That's exactly the kind of example I mean when I say community-based food businesses. But they're not stopping with this. Their next collaboration involves Snowville Creamery that has trucks that are empty, partly empty when they come from Ohio to Columbus with their milk. So they're bringing in produce from Ohio farms from Southeast Ohio to store at the Columbus Food Bank, which has excess warehouse space. The Greener Grocer, which is a retail store right down the street from Jenny's Ice Cream, stores its food there at the food bank, and then when they want to come bring it into the shop to buy, they cart it over. So now you have three new businesses, or I should say three additional roles being played, where Snowville is collaborating with produce farms, collaborating with the food bank, and also helping a grocer sell more fresh food. They see this as the core of a food hub that will deliver fresh food to low-income consumers. That vision would not have surfaced without ACENET starting that stuff 30 years ago, without the farmers and the Casa Nueva starting that 40 years ago. This is long-term work. With that in mind, let me focus a little bit on your region. I'll tell you some things that you know and some things you don't know. This is the region. I couldn't put it in one circle that sort of made sense, so I put it in two circles. But it's those 5 counties in southern Arizona. 1.2 million residents in this region. Total income is $41 billion. If you don't think you have clout in the economy, remember that you and your neighbors spend $41 billion every year, and that has a considerable role to play in the future of southern Arizona. Main source of income, yellow line, is interest, dividend, and rent. That's been the sort of main source of income. That's a sign there's some retirees. I think that's a good sign that capitalism's worked for some folks. Often, though, that does mean an aging population when that's high. The purple line is transfer payments. Those are government payments like unemployment insurance and so on, rising much more rapidly, and now the #1 source of income in the region. And the third largest source of income, government jobs. For those of you in the room who think we should get the government out of our lives, be careful. Because public payments are a considerable part of what the personal income stream is for southern Arizona. An unfortunate fact is that 1/4 of the population lives below the poverty level at which children qualify for free or reduced lunch at school. And it's a challenge for an agricultural region like southern Arizona, like the rest of the United States, to say 1/3 of our population is vulnerable about food. And in fact, we're not sure they can afford a $2.60 meal 5 times a week. Is the answer to that federal policy, or is the answer to that reweaving some connections in the community so people actually eat better from local food products? 58% of the residents are overweight or obese, which is less than many parts of the country I work in. 8% of the residents have diabetes, again lower than the national, and than many regions I work with. The medical costs for diabetes and overweightness in this region are $768 million, and for the state of Arizona, $3.8 billion. So when you have local authorities say local food is small potatoes, remind them this might cut into their budget that they're paying for uninsured people having medical needs because of the bad diets and faulty exercise we have. Only 26% of the residents in the region eat the minimum. I'm sorry, this is data for Arizona as a whole. 26% of residents eat the minimum number of fruits and vegetables recommended by health officials, which is 5 fruits and vegetables a day. 52% exercise adequately. I didn't want to. This guy, I'm sure, is exercising well at the food bank. In general, I don't like to put people's faces with bad health outcomes. A photo that Nick took, 2,300 farms in this region. This is the food bank farm outside of Tucson. 68% of the farms in the region sell less than $10,000 worth of product a year, and 10% sell more than $100,000. I know some economists and some planners who would say, focus on those big farms because they're the ones who are really serious full-time farmers. And that's interesting action, obviously. If you focus on that exclusively, though, you miss two of every 3 of your farms. And I think especially in this region, you have to really think about what's the proper role that a small farm plays. We can't all go out and buy land to get bigger. What can small farms do to respond to market conditions more rapidly and to adapt to consumer tastes, to really create new niches in the market that big farms can't afford to do because they're big and sort of settled into their ways? What's the food system that actually has a proper place for the large as well as the small? And again, half of the farms in this region are less than 50 acres. And you know, where I come from, Minnesota, a lot of times those farms are belittled as just hobby farms, but that's half of your farms. A lot of your farms are less than 50 acres. How do we build a food system based on that reality that really gives these people, these farmers like yourselves, a better livelihood? Here are the main products. We have some trouble with data suppression because the USDA doesn't like to report on data that will identify a single producer, so we don't have complete data, but as to the best we can count, $25 million of the fruits, nuts, and berries, a lot of that I think was probably pecans. $24 million of the forage crops, you can read the rest. But some interesting production here. If you're a family trying to feed yourself, where do you go on that chart? One of the dilemmas is the main products we have are commodities, raised primarily for industrial processing. We need them, but our food system is really oriented to the commodity side and not to the side of feeding the people who live nearby. And that's the shift you all and we all are trying to make. There are 64 vegetable farms listed in the farm census with 3,000 acres, and that's a 15% decrease in the number of farms selling vegetables in the last 5 years at a time when people are trying to buy more vegetables. That also is a sign that the markets here that farmers face are disconnected from the consumer market in southern Arizona because they're not in sync. They're not growing together. 210 farms have fruit or nut orchards, $25 million of sales. 177 farms sell directly to consumers. That may be most of the people in this room. $2.2 million worth of sales. It's only 0.1% of what farmers in this region sell on an average year. 0.1% compared with the national average of 0.4%. Lots of room to grow this industry. 33 farms sell organic products, a total of $3.4 million worth of sales. With that in mind, I'd like to show you the last 40 years of farming in southern Arizona. From some data that the U.S. government collects, which is reported county by county, so I can look at combining these 5 counties into one story, and these are all the farms that we've listed, and their sales and their costs. So the orange line is how much farmers have sold all their products for since 1969, all their crops and all their livestock. The maroon line shows how much it cost them to produce those products. And you see rising growth in both cases. In fact, every time the farm income goes up, it seems input dealers are there to collect a little more money. And rapid growth, really, some very nice sign of new markets, new income and all that, except that if you subtract the expenses from the income, you get this red line, which has been declining steadily over time. So in the last 40 years of farming, despite this rapid growth in sales, no real benefit to the farmers. And as you see, farmers make less money now than they did in 1969 after all these rising markers. But I also think this is only one part of the story because the dollar has actually declined dramatically since this chart was developed. The dollar is worth 1/5 today what it was when this chart was started. So I like to adjust this for inflation because it gives us a way of answering a slightly different question, which is how hard does a farm family have to work today to earn $1 compared with 40 years ago? Here's the same data adjusted for inflation. Actually, very different patterns. You see farmers holding their costs as steady as possible until about 1993, and then those start to increase. I think this is a sign of some new growth in agriculture, which is good. But you also see a real faster decline of income from selling crops and livestock. A huge peak in the 1974 we'll talk more about later. But basically, since 1979, a sort of steady erosion of the fortunes of farmers, despite new production taking on new costs. Overall, farmers make $146 million less farming in southern Arizona today than they did in 1969. And since 1999, over the last 10 years, there's been about a $300 million loss to the region from the way we do farming in the conventional way. Again, for those folks who think local food is small potatoes, think about reducing these losses by feeding your neighbors. To say the same thing in words, farmers in general produce about $300 million worth of commodities in this region each year, and it costs them about $320 million on average to produce them. And it's a real question for the region: how long can you continue to farm under these circumstances? An average loss of $20 million each year for the last 10 years, steadily in a row. How do farm families survive? Two things that show up in the farm census are farm-related income. You can make more money often renting out your land than farming it. So increasingly, land rental has become an important source of farm income. Secondly, federal supports, as you know, are fairly small here, but it's still $12 million that helps offset those losses if you happen to be producing one of the crops that's supported with the commodity program. This shows the forms of net income. This is the same line you saw before. It looks more jagged because the scale has changed, but it's the same data basically. The blue line shows the farm-related income. See how farmers have pretty much been increasing. That's gone up and down a little bit, but it's been rising steadily in this period that farmers have experienced losses. And government payments are pretty unreliable. They go up and down a lot and don't really compensate for the loss. The real answer, of course, is that most farm families have an off-farm job. And that doesn't show up in this data, but that's how people get health benefits. That's how they get some relief from the seasonal cycles of agriculture, is to send someone from the family to work off the farm to help pay for the costs of farming. And again, it works in a sense, but it's also not a very sustainable paradigm. If we really believe in eating, if we believe in having healthy farms, we have to really rethink what we're doing with food. This chart breaks down the orange line from the previous chart into income from crops in the green line and income from livestock. You know why this has changed more than I do, but I think it's very interesting to note that crop income has risen so much in the last few years. But I think what's really kind of telling is that the income from livestock has been very steadily eroding. And this is true in most regions of the United States. My argument would be that if you want a strong food system in southern Arizona, the first step to take, or one central step to take, is to return the ability for people to raise livestock to actually build wealth by raising livestock. And that again can be best done by connecting those animal raisers with local consumers who might value having those animals on the land. And also that allows you to think about animals being a source of fertility rather than chemicals, actually growing the fertility that you need to farm, and having a cycle that sort of can be built from its own resources within the community. In the last farm census, almost 3 of every 4 farms reported net loss to the farm census. Now we know some farms are very good at showing a tax loss because that's good for their tax payment. It relieves their tax burden. We also know some farms are actually run as tax losses for investors. Yet in a farm area, a rural area, in a country that says we feed the world, when 3 of every 4 farms are reporting a net loss, it doesn't suggest agriculture is on a strong footing. It makes you wonder how we're going to eat in 20 years. This chart shows the maroon line from the earlier charts broken into what farmers spend their money on. And as you see, rising labor costs, falling costs for buying livestock, the purple line, falling costs for buying feed, the yellow line. Energy costs really peaked in the 1970s and have been much lower until the last few years. My question to you is not so much these individual lines. I would just point out that energy is the main way farmers reduce their costs, is by using energy more efficiently. That's the main thing they've been able to do, but also getting out of livestock was another way. The other question, though, is how much of these inputs are actually sourced within southern Arizona? A lot of your labor is, but some is not. How much of your oil is produced here in southern Arizona? How much of the chemicals and fertilizer are manufactured here in southern Arizona? And how much oil do they depend on? My point is basically that these data also suggest a flow of money away from the region as farmers buy the inputs they use to farm. And my calculation, which I think is very conservative, is that about $200 million is spent every year by farmers here farming at a loss, buying the inputs they need from far away. I think it's more than this, but we don't have really firm numbers about it. What could we do to bring those costs to be local costs by creating fertilizer and compost and other things that are produced in the region that produce fertility at home that don't require us to buy things from far away? The third part of the food economy I'd like to focus on is the consumer side. And here, this is very interesting. Consumers in this region buy $3.3 billion worth of food each year. Again, primarily from far away. So about $3 billion of that, again, a cautious estimate, is spent buying food sourced outside of the region. Here's the market for food for people who live in southern Arizona. For those of you who are growers, is a $417 million market for meat worth going after? Is it enough to interest you? Summarize the story. I should say just one more thing. I'm not saying it's easy to get there. We lack the infrastructure that makes it efficient to bring food from a farm like yours to these consumers. And that's the key steps. We have to build that infrastructure. It's going to be a very long process of building. At the same time, the markets are here. People already have these dollars in their pockets. They're already spending them somewhere. It's just a matter of reconfiguring how they buy those dollars. So to summarize the story of the data, the region loses $20 million a year in farm production, pretty reliably, while spending $200 million buying inputs from far away, while the neighbors spend $3 billion buying food from far away. The total losses come up to about $3.2 billion a year, which is 10 times the value of all the farm products produced by all the farmers in the region in an average year. This is not small potatoes. The good news, I guess, is that if you look at the consumer market for food, it goes way off the charts. I mean, I can't even chart it out because we have such a small numbers compared to the consumer market. It means that growers who are on the conventional system have a choice that's very real of saying, how much do I want to put my bet on the commodity industry, which has not been rewarding me well for 10 years or 40 years, and how much do I want to connect with local consumers who might value having me as a farm to visit, who might value me as a taxpayer helping pay for schools, who might value having a farm that they can come work on. What's the balance that any grower wants to strike in that? I think the good news of this depressing story is that there's incredible opportunity here if we can find a way to marshal the production and the distribution. If consumers in your region spent less than $5 a week, if every person spent that much buying food directly from a local farm, it would produce $237 million worth of new farm income, which is 2/3 of what people currently get selling all the products they sell. A subtle shift like this, nobody has to earn more money to do this. They just have to decide to spend money on local farms. Could we marshal a campaign in which people say, I'm going to buy $5 a week from some farmer in Arizona, in southern Arizona? That could have potentially a huge impact. I'd like to step back and show you some data from some other regions to show you how your region compares with other places that I work in. Here's the data for the state of Arizona as a whole. You'll notice the chart for Arizona resembles the chart for southern Arizona pretty greatly, doesn't it? The numbers are bigger, but you have the same pattern of sort of decline, a little bit of improvement in the last few years, but overall, farmers making less money now than they used to. And the last few years are indeed quite scary in Arizona as a whole. Altogether, farmers making $1 billion less farming today than they did 40 years ago, after doubling productivity. We may want a farming in this world, in this country, that's less productive and more rewarding. At the same time, farmers have brought in $11 billion of new value into the state economy, which is nothing to sneeze at. This is important money to have when you're facing budget crisis and so on. There's real wealth produced by that commodity production, but it's not really accruing to farmers. The data for the United States goes all the way back to 1929, and I like to show that story because it kind of illuminates where we are. I have farmers in the Midwest telling me the best year for agriculture in American history, 2011, we've never had such good sales, things are really looking up, and in some ways that's true. At the same time, you see the same pattern of every time farm sales rise, input prices rise commensurately. And over the last, since 1929, basically farmers are not much better off than they were in 1929. Again, when you adjust this data for inflation, you get a chart that's very, if you look between these arrows, you get the data points we looked at for Arizona, and you see basically very similar patterns. It's not improving as much nationally as it is in Arizona, but it's very similar. Peak years in 1974, really steady declines. In fact, when you adjust for inflation, you notice in 2011, the biggest year in American history, farmers made less money than they made in 1929 after 9 years of a rural depression in the United States. In 1929, we knew we had a crisis on our hands, and we were talking about how to feed people, how to get the farm production that was actually too bountiful into the hands of urban consumers. Now we think we're having the best year ever. It's a real signature of how much denial we're in as a society about agriculture. I'd like to also just dwell a little bit on 1974. This is a year that farmers brought in $120 billion of profit in one single year from farming. $120 billion is a lot of money. Why did that happen? A lot of you may remember the days when OPEC decided to restrict their oil production to raise the price of oil. And they were successful in getting the price of oil in 1973 up to $40 a barrel in current dollars, which caused panic in our country. We had people waiting in line 2 or 3 hours at a gas station wondering if they could buy gas. We were spending money like crazy buying oil from the Middle East, and it wasn't coming back. We actually were losing a significant part of our dollar supply. So the folks in Washington sat down and came up with what they thought was a win-win-win situation. They said, the Soviet Union has bank accounts that are in dollars. They had a crop failure, so they need to buy some grain. We can supply extra grain. We'll get farmers to plant more, and the farmers will make more money. The Russian people will be better fed, and we get our dollars back. It seemed like a very clever way to make things work out. And you may remember the Secretary of Agriculture getting on the radio and TV and saying to farmers, plant fence row to fence row, get big or get out of agriculture. We will find you permanent markets abroad. And if you are not ramping up to produce as much as possible, you'll be left behind in the wake of this new emerging permanent export market. As you see from the chart, those permanent markets didn't exist. We did have Russia wanting to buy grain for a couple of years, and in 1974 they called us up and said, we don't need your grain because we had a really good harvest. We're going to stop. And farmers had ramped up production at the request of the government, and we're now stuck with a lot of grain that they had produced very well they could not sell. I interviewed farmers in the 1980s. Actually, I should just add. So what happens is in 1974, farm income goes back to what it used to be with one key difference. Farmers have new debt now they didn't have in 1972. I interviewed farmers during what we now call the farm credit crisis, started by this very years, in which farmers realized they had more debt than they could handle, that they had taken on debts that were foolish because they thought the price would stay high and it didn't stay high. Does that resemble the situation we're in today? It's exactly the same crisis in which lenders who want a really big cash flow for their next quarterly report say to low-income home buyers or farmers, you take on debts we don't think you're actually going to be able to pay off because it'll be good for our bottom line in the short term. If we were closer to farmers, we would have seen the trouble signs in the housing market much sooner than we did. And this is, again, one reason we have to knit together the connections between farmers and consumers so that we actually see these patterns before we get into trouble again. My main point, though, is the only good year you can point to since 1970 on this chart actually led to further decline. And so, again, there's no sign of lasting strength, lasting capacity building out of this farm economy. Yeah, this map I'm going to show you takes these 2 points of time and these arrows. If farm income was higher in 2002 at the kind of depths of this recent depression than it was in '69, you'll see a light green or a dark green county. If it's lower, you'll see a yellow or red county. As you quickly see, in 6 of every 7 counties in the United States, farmers are making less money in 2002 than they did in 1969. The most sustained, biggest areas of loss are where I come from, the corn and bean rotation in the United States, which arguably is the most efficient agriculture in the world, is producing the most sustained losses. It's also interesting, Yuma County looks pretty good in this chart. Gary back here has told me several stories about Yuma County, again, which I have not had a chance to see myself, but I understand there's a big dairy there and lots of lettuce. Lots of other vegetables are produced in a major quantity with the help of federally subsidized irrigation. Feedlots in New Mexico, feedlot in Colorado, feedlot and big dairies in Idaho, feedlot in North Carolina. Why are those success stories nationally? Because there was almost nothing there in 1969. Somebody with a lot of money plopped down a big feedlot, creating new agricultural income that wasn't there, and essentially taking animals from somewhere else. From the perspective of Colorado, you might call this economic development. From the perspective of Ohio, you would call it theft. Because the animals that used to be produced on family farms and producing fertility and producing a livelihood have been migrating to feedlots where they don't command enough money that a family farmer can do that anymore in Ohio. So this is what I mean by the very uneven development of food in our country, and how basically a few places are favored at the expense of the kind of broad-based family-style agriculture we used to thrive on in this country. Something else happened in 1973, as John here started to point out earlier. We have big piles of corn we can't sell. We have a new enzyme process that makes it very cheap to make high fructose corn sweetener. It becomes the sweetener of choice. Again, fueled by the fact we have big piles of corn that are surplus we have to dump somehow. The next year we start noticing the number of overweight kids rising. This is a complicated story because in 1970 we also tended to lose the two-parent family. We tended to lose the homemaker who was staying at home thinking about what their kids were eating reliably every day. But we also started buying into the convenience of getting packaged food sweetened with high fructose sweetener. My nutritionist friends I've talked with say that the field is divided about this right now, but the folks I agree with the most say they have this model. When I have sugar, something with sugar in it, I have an enzyme in my body that says, Ken, stop, you've had enough. When I have high fructose corn sweetener, there's no such biological signal making it easy for me to stop. It's very easy for me to keep consuming and keep buying because it'll taste good. To the extent you can say this is causal, you can connect the oil crisis of 1973 with overweight kids today. That's how complicated and how broad this global system has become, and why we have to be very careful in moving forward that we actually produce steps that provide genuine progress for ourselves. A few more scary facts and I'll stop. In the country that says we feed the world, half of our public school students qualify for free or reduced school lunch. We lose 3,000 people a year to food poisoning at a medical cost of $152 billion a year. The medical costs of overweightness and diabetes total $174 billion each year. If you add these two costs together, $152 billion and $174 billion from these two medical costs I just identified, that's $326 billion. That's more than all the money earned by all the farmers in the United States selling all the products they sell in an average year. So essentially, when I buy a bushel of corn, I give a dollar to a farmer for the corn. I give $1 to the medical system to treat me for eating it. This is not sustainable for any of us. Okay, the happy news, and then we'll try to wind into where we go with all this. One of the rising forces of American agriculture, I would argue, is the direct sales you folks are specializing in, but it's happening all over the country. Direct sales rose at 10% per year from 2002 to 2007 nationally. And These blue counties represent the counties in the United States where that is happening the most. Here's the national sales chart. Compare this with the sales charts we saw before in the commodity industry. Steadier, more reliable growth, isn't it? But it's only 0.4% of what farmers sell. On the one hand, it's very tiny. On the other hand, it's a tremendous opportunity, and it's rising more steadily than the commodity industry. Organic sales are rising in the same places as the direct sales are, with one exception. Southwest Wisconsin is a home to the organic industry, partly because of the growth of Organic Valley, the cooperative that sells milk, orange juice, eggs, cheese, a bunch of other products, mostly in metropolitan areas, or organic products. This is the corporate headquarters of Organic Valley in a town of 400 in southwest Wisconsin. They're actually adding about a third as much new space to the building right now as I talk. This is their sales chart from 1988. And actually, that's an old chart. This is up. I should say it's up to $700 million of sales as of 2010. In 1988, Organic Valley was 8 farmers in a living room in southwest Wisconsin, having a meeting something like this but smaller, saying, "This isn't working for any of us. What are we going to do?" And they started thinking about how could they connect more closely with markets, how could they actually have a product that would have a higher value, how could they do organic sales in a way that would become mainstream. They had some power struggles, they had some disagreements, they had some frustrations, but after 10 years of base building, suddenly it starts to take off, and as I said, it's now a $700 million cooperative of cooperatives with 1,600 member farmers nationally, selling very high quality items, mostly to metro markets, not necessarily to their neighbors. But it's been a real success story. Compare this growth with the growth of the mainstream farm economy. In Cedar Falls, Waterloo area of Iowa, I did a study of an 8-county region there in Black Hawk. The local food, Buy Fresh, Buy Local campaign started in 1998 with 1 nursing home, 1 restaurant, and 1 school buying $100,000 worth of local foods from local farms. 10 years later, 26 people buying $2.6 million worth of food. Their sales chart looks a lot like the sales chart of Organic Valley. It takes several years to build up the visibility, the procedures, to get known, to get connected, and once that settles in, it starts to take off. An economist calculated that if the residents of this 8-county region purchased 5 fruits and vegetables a day that could be grown in the region, things like apples and cabbage and grapes, that were producible in Iowa. And they bought them only when they were ripe. There was no processing involved. But they ate 5 of those a day for 3 months of the year during harvest. It produced this many new jobs, and this much labor income. Towns all over the country have been throwing incentives at factories that promise less hiring than this. And they've seen the people take the incentives and then leave to go to somewhere else. Maybe Singapore, maybe Colorado, once they found a better deal. As my friend Wayne Roberts in Toronto says, you cannot outsource a local food economy. If the investments you make in local food transactions will stay in the region, building wealth for generations to come. That's a much smarter investment than investing in a factory that might leave as soon as you give them some incentives. If someone had told me 20 years ago that African American and Latino and Hmong youth in Milwaukee would be producing the fertilizer needed by commercial scale farmers in Wisconsin, I would have looked very quizzically at them. But it's been happening for years in Milwaukee. Moreover, the kids run this integrated system. Fish inside this greenhouse nibble on the plants, also get other food. Their manure in the water gets poured on the plants nearby to fertilize those plants. Learning ecological cycles, managing a farm stand, CSA, selling directly to restaurants, getting business skills, work skills, inner city kids, an incredible collection of skills and capacities being built in the food system all in one place. Requiring considerable subsidy at this point, but also a very thriving model. Then Greensgrow Gardens in Philadelphia is a story I love to tell. Mary Seton Corboy and her husband were restaurant owners about 20 years ago in suburban New Jersey. They had the kind of destination restaurant where you would come and eat a full meal and go back to the city. And one weekend they had a retreat with themselves, and they said, you know, we really like our customers, we love our restaurant, but we're nervous about what's happening in the city. It's just not getting any better. We'd like to do something to make it better. So they sold their restaurant. And they went to the city of Philadelphia and said, could you find us an acre of ground that we could use for a farm? And the city said, sure, do we have a deal for you? They gave him a brownfield, 1 acre brownfield in Central City, Philadelphia. They gave him a 99-year lease for $1. And this is a neighborhood actually I student taught when I was in college. It was the teacher I worked for actually carried a baseball bat with him all day long, because that was his reminder to the kids that he was in charge. He never used it, but he sort of, it was a very poignant symbol. It was a very tough neighborhood, very tough environment to teach in. They put their farm there. They built a cement container, as you see here, on the ground to keep the pollution below ground, and they put new soil on top, new organic soil. And the plants look pretty happy in downtown Philadelphia. They also put up raised tables that have hydroponic lettuce and other greens that they sell, again, keeping that from the pollution in the ground. They built this, 10 by 15 storage shed with 2x4s and fiberglass and an air conditioner to be their cold storage unit. It was USDA plans that they found, and they put this thing up. With this and a sod roof. With this cold storage unit, they can take food from 75 farms in New Jersey and Pennsylvania who bring it to this shed. There are 40 restaurants in the area that try to feature local foods. The restaurants can walk down with their cart, pick up the food they want, and take it back to the restaurant. The farmers bring their stuff in. Total sales in this 1 acre operation in Central City, Philadelphia, last I checked, were $900,000. Now, most of that, to be honest, is ornamental plants, nursery plants, because neighbors are putting up new trees in their yard and shrubbery and that stuff. And a considerable amount of that money is trading food from other farms. It's a food hub, if you will, that grew very organically. And ironically, you could make more money on an acre in Philadelphia because the buyers are right there. But if you can do this on a farm in Central City, Philadelphia, it seems like you should be able to do it in lots of other places, for instance, southern Arizona. My final story is unfortunately might be a kind of paradigm for what's happening in lots of smaller communities around the country. The town of Viroqua, Wisconsin, where a factory closed very precipitously in July of 2009. A national manufacturer that had a printing and packaging operation decided that it was more efficient for them to consolidate their operation into one firm in a distant state. So a small town of 4,000 called Viroqua loses 85 of its best jobs overnight. They're the only factory in town that has this many people paid well. Here's the factory. The head of the Economic Development Authority gets on the phone with the executive from the company and says, "We've been supporting you since 1974. We've given you incentives. We've been there building a strong commercial context for you. Now you've taken 85 of our best jobs out of town. What are you going to do to pay us back?" A very gutsy move on the part of this EDA official. The executive was surprised by this question and stammered for 20 minutes, kind of talking around her and saying whatever he said. And then finally he got a little worn down and he said, "What would you like me to do?" And she said, "Sell us the building." And he did. So for a very tiny price, this community now owns this factory built in 1974, certified clean enough to be a place to handle food. They're turning it into a regional food processing center, and they have 100,000 square feet that they own. They just got a $2 million grant from the federal government to improve the facilities, the lighting, the electricity, the water, to make it a really humming manufacturing plant for the purpose of food. This is their model. A produce distributor that is young and aggressive, who wants to ramp up production from his farm and lots of other farms, all the way from Chicago to St. Paul and Minneapolis. Really about a 400-mile stretch he wants to sell to. Another produce distributor who wants to stay small and focused on Amish farmers who want to ramp up their produce production a little bit, but not to be big guns. They're both going to have their own place in this plant. In fact, this guy has his cooler set up already. There's a guy in town who's a very good manufacturer who wants to make gluten for the food processing industry. Another school that wants to make gluten-free foods in a separate building for their students and employees. A baker that says, "I'll have a space like this that when people are not sitting down having coffee with their pastries, you can use it as a public meeting space." So we're very, very careful thinking about multi-use within the space. Networked with hospitals and schools that say, "We'll buy 10% of our produce through the center once it's up and running." Organic Valley nearby to offer some technical assistance. Amish farmers saying, "We'll ramp up production to meet the demand." A farmer nearby that says, "I have a root cellar you can use until you decide if you want to invest in your own." And then a food co-op that has been doing 40 years of business with 40 farms that says, "We'll bring our Rolodex into the equation so that we're all going to thrive from this new center in the region." Notice the networks of connection that are built. the community capacities that are built in this cluster of businesses that's forming. Notice that each of those arrows represents potentially some flow of money that's going to stay within the region. A very promising possibility of taking what could have been a disaster to the local economy and turning it into a real exciting food hub for the future. I want to say one quick word about the Farm Bill, because we're trying to write a Farm Bill if we ever get the shenanigans in DC straightened out. I don't feel really optimistic, but the key thing I'd say about the Farm Bill debate right now is that we have seen that throwing cash after commodities is a very good way to extract wealth from our rural areas. And it's a failed paradigm. We're really lucky they're actually seriously discussing for the first time getting rid of the subsidies as a cash basis. Rather, we should see federal money as an investment in lasting capacity. These dollars are very precious. We want to use them well. We want to use them in ways that will stay in the community. Investing in things like food hubs, like knowledge bases to know what the local food activity is. Investing in things that really will stick around for the long haul. That's my best guess about how we build in our communities health, wealth, connection, and capacity. I welcome your questions, your ideas, sort of whatever time we have left now to really have some discussion. And of course, I will be here the rest of the day as well. If you want to find me, this is how you do that. Thank you. What's our timing like now?
Let's see. So it's 20 after 10. We could go for a few minutes with questions. If anyone has questions.
Yes, sir.
I noticed you're using a lot of census and USDA data. I just have kind of a basic question. What's the definition of a farm for purposes of all that?
That's a good question. The definition of a farm is any rural operation that tends to sell $1,000 worth of product or more per year. So it's a very wide open definition. And that does contribute to the number of small farms we have. Yeah.
So is the NRCS Hoop House grant program, is that kind of what you're saying, like taking money from the commodities and investing them in the farmers? Would that be an example?
Well, I think it's a good example. It's a more short-term investment because the hoop house won't last as long. I think federal money might be better spent on things like warehouses, distributing warehouses so that there's a good place to store food within every X million people in the country. So there's a really good place for security purposes. If we have a breakdown in oil, if we have a breakdown in disease, we should have some food stored that we can really get out to people. Root cellars, warehouses, frozen food space, maybe some quick frozen vegetable processing plants. Whatever infrastructure will really make it possible for people to thrive. And then some of that money could also go in, as it has been, into planning those regions or getting people together to sit down and sort of co-invest and to really make that happen in a very efficient way so people are not competing with each other but are really, we're maximizing the chances for collaboration. But it could be having the best data set about food and where it's grown and how it gets to market and really having that very clearly known, and having a good set like that is not trivial in being able to make decisions to adapt to changing market conditions over time.
Can you repeat the question?
So the question was, the question was, is investing in Hoop House a good example of kind of a new federal approach? And that was my long answer to that. In the back.
Yeah, two questions. You thought said rural was part of your definition of the farm, so no urban production would be included in there. And then the other thing is, in your list of the four goals, resiliency doesn't quite seem to be explicit. Where would you place that?
Okay, that's a great question. So the question was, I'll just repeat for the videotape, was if the definition of farms means rural, then it doesn't include urban farms. By definition, that's sort of a problem, and it's good to talk about that. And then the other thing is, how does resiliency figure into my set of goals that I have there for the food system? First of all, you're right that this USDA has never counted urban farms. And one of the real restrictions that USDA has is they're actually prohibited by law from working in urban areas because it's seen as a rural issue and not seen as an urban issue. And there are people at USDA who say the law allows them to go into urban areas, but the basic decision has been that we do rural stuff and other people do urban stuff. And it's the idea that you'd seriously produce food in an urban setting has never been taken seriously by policymakers. I think that will change if we can write a farm bill, but I'm not sure we can write one. In terms of resilience, the way I would just basically place that is if you have the capacity and the intelligence to make decisions at a local level, you can be more resilient. And I believe in resilience as a real feature of the system we have. But to me, the idea of sort of building the connection, the capacity is how you have the power to be resilient. I'm totally in support of that, but I also don't want to have a laundry list of goals. I want to keep that down to a fairly simple step. So I think if you don't have the capacity and the connection, you can't be resilient. But if you do, you have the option of making good choices. Gary wanted to say something about the urban farming thing too.
Well, something else. I do help so many communities on getting the direct marketing part of their economy jump-starting, and I'm fascinated by the farm input outsourcing, and I was wondering if you could suggest 3 or 4 things that we could do to help that. In other words, if we're trying to grow more farms, we're going to need to find those inputs, and how can we find those locally? What communities are really tackling that one?
Well, the first thing, I wish you could come to every speech I give and ask that question, because it's a huge flow of money that no one wants to really talk about this, because this really does get at the heart of kind of the whole industry that supports the industrial way of farming. And so everyone kind of takes a deep breath at that slide and says, let's not think about that much. And it's also, as you say, an extremely viable way to move forward. Composting, manuring is clearly a very feasible way to do this. The more your farm is run on green energy produced within the region, that means biodiesel. That means more solar panels to the extent that they are produced locally. It means more windmills. It means basically getting off the grid and doing things that really are, again, which a lot of you folks are doing, and doing it probably as much as you can afford to do. Those steps are all really crucial. Having loans from local lenders who reinvest back in the community is one way of localizing those input costs. Having machinery that can be produced in the region is one way of localizing those costs. You look at all the things that farmers spend money on, and you folks, again, know your farms very well. If you look at what you're spending money on, you probably every week are saying, how can I do this more locally? How can I do this in a way that builds more strength around me to kind of support the farm that I'm on? And you want to shun away from those input costs that are going far away as much as you can, because you recognize you lose your economic clout at that point. So hundreds of millions of dollars of opportunity everywhere. I think, to my mind, manuring and composting really seems to kind of surface really early, simply because it's the fertility that's so based on fossil fuels, and it really suggests bringing animals back to a kind of family scale and community scale agriculture. And that whole process seems really rich to do. And in an urban setting, there's all this organic matter that needs to be composted. Let's make fertility out of that for commercial farms. Yes, sir.
Is your report you did, the study for the Southern Arizona Food Shed, is that available?
Yes, it is. And that will be, I think the food bank already has posted that on their website. If not, they will. If not, I will. It's going to be widely available. This presentation is being videotaped, and also the slides are going to be posted on the food bank website too, so that you can just have access to all this data and you can play with it as much as you want. And there's a video of me talking if you want to show that to other folks.
Excellent.
Yeah.
My second part of my question is, how does drought come into the study that you did? Do you have a matrix that includes the challenge that we're experiencing with drought?
I wouldn't say my ways of calculating are very sensitive to drought at all. And one of the dilemmas for me is I do data in my office and I get numbers, but I have to come here to really find out what they mean. So you probably are telling me that some of the decline in recent years is really due to drought, and that may change the picture if we get out of this.
It depends on different people's operations.
Yeah.
Like her operation is more pasture, mine is more rangeland, and so I can't control.
Yeah.
I don't have the infrastructure that could possibly handle that.
Yeah. It's very crucial, and again, it's another reason to be resilient, and it's another reason to have organic matter in the soil. that the more we can put those organic nutrients there, they absorb more water, they retain it longer, rain doesn't flow away as fast. All those things are really good to do. We've been convinced not to put organic matter in because we could treat the land as something that was a chemical addict that needed chemicals every year to keep going. Okay, I think that's all for now, but I'm happy to be around fielding other conversations as we have chances today. Thanks very much for close attention to numbers.